Today is March 28th, 2019. My name is Jenny Matz, and it's my great pleasure to be interviewing Ann Curry for the Interviews and Oral History of Television. Okay, Ann, thank you so much for being here today. We're going to start at the beginning. Can you tell us what was your name at birth?
Ann Curry.
And where were you born and when?
Agana, Guam, 1956. I was born to a Japanese woman who was not yet an American citizen and an American father. They met during World War II. She was a war bride, and she subsequently became an American citizen.
Tell us a little bit about your childhood. What were your parents like?
My parents were incredibly interesting. They never spoke about World War II and their meeting, but they were so different from one another. My mother grew up on a rice farm that had been in operation in her family for more than 400 years. She comes from farmers and also from Buddhist monks and priests, people who've been traced back to particular temples, who experienced the Meiji Restoration and the effort at that time to get rid of Buddhist symbols and how they buried them to hide them, to protect them. There are a lot of stories there. But as a result, she was a very practical woman, a woman who traveled far afield from the conditions of her birth in Yamagata, Japan. And it was because of the war, World War II, and her experience fleeing bombing and eventually making her way to a job to help support her hungry family after the war, to a job where she was a streetcar conductor, which is how my father met her, getting on the streetcar and then riding it as many times as he could to try to work up the courage to ask her to noodles. They were both kids, 17, 18 years old, and they fell in love, and my parents would eventually tell me the story when I would persistently ask them that they almost weren't allowed to marry because of my parents' different races. My father was told when he told the military what you had to do, you had to ask for permission to marry. He asked my mother to marry him. I think they were 18. And he was told by his commanding officer, "Bob, your eyes are starting to slant. You're turning into a bamboo American. We're going to put you on a boat. You're going to Morocco. Say goodbye to this woman. You're not marrying her." And he told her this, and she told me how she knew that he would never come back, even though he insisted that he would. How she said goodbye to them at the train and sobbed, knowing she'd never see him again, and how she didn't see him for years until he was able to figure out a way to come back. But at that time, she was dying of tuberculosis. And there's a whole story about that I can go on. But what I learned, I grew up with parents who came from two very different worlds, who were fierce in their love for each other, overcoming the prejudices of their time, who presented me with a set of lessons about how to choose a meaningful life.
What were some of those lessons?
Well, I would ask my father, "What should you be when you grow up?" What I would ask, I said, "Dad, what should I be when I grow up?" And he would say, "Well, Ann, whatever you decide, you should choose something that is of some service to someone else, because then and only then will you know on your last day, as you breathe your last breath, that it mattered that you were born," which is a pretty heavy thing to hear when you're 11. But that was exactly how he would say it every time I asked. So this idea of doing something of service seemed important. What could be of some service? What could help others? How can that contribute to having a meaningful life? I think that played a big part in why I became a journalist.
Yeah. And from your mother, do you think you inherited any characteristics or traits from your mother?
I inherited from my mother a deep empathy because of her experience with racism, with sexism, with being a woman trying to mother 5 children in the world. She struggled to speak in English and be understood. And so I felt enormous empathy for her. And I also had a sense about a place other than America. You know, one side of my family, my ancestors have been traced to the 1600s in America when as they were, laundresses and they were farmers. They fought in the Revolutionary War. They were in musket brigades even before the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, on both sides of the Civil War. And on my mother's side, I am from immigrants. So both of those two things clearly have contributed to making me. And I think those things, even before memory, before I even knew about them, probably influenced what I've become.
Now, you didn't grow up in Guam. Can you talk about where you grew up and what some of your interests were as a child?
Sure. My dad was a career Navy man, so we traveled all over the world. Every 2 years we would move, so I grew up all over the world. We spent some time in Japan. My father wanted us to know my mother's culture. We spent a lot of time in California and Hawaii and Virginia and Guam, and I'm sure I've forgotten someplace. And so as a result of all this moving around, my family became very tight, became foundational. And I also realized that people thought had different ideas wherever you went. And I also had my mother's ideas, which came from somewhere else. And so this idea that my thinking wasn't limited to, even in high school, it wasn't limited to what other people thought. I always knew that there were deeper truths elsewhere if I looked.
Did you have an inkling of what this service was that you would go into at a young age?
I think it was really influenced by the events of my time growing up. I am a child of the rise of television, television colorized in my lifetime, and it became highly influential, especially journalism on television. And I remember watching the coverage of the civil rights movement. I remember seeing and talking to my dad about what was happening in a place called the South and some of these states that I didn't know. And this began a series of conversations that lasted throughout our lives together, debate about what was happening in the world. So the civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement, the gay rights movement, all influenced, Watergate, all influenced my sense that there were deeper truths elsewhere, and that when people have access to what's really going on, that they have the power to create the future. This is always a story of humanity, I've now learned as a student of history. It is because we know that we have a chance to do something about it. And when we don't know, when people have no voice and they're not heard, it's easy for them to be mowed over, and for us to maybe not always have informed choices. And I grew up learning about being a member of a democracy and how wonderful that is, and realized that it was really important in a democracy for people to know what was happening. So all this influenced me in my high school years: Watergate, the civil rights movement, Vietnam War. And so at the dinner table I would debate these topics with my father, and we would have huge debates, huge as in my brothers and sisters would pick up their plates and eat elsewhere because Dad and I were yelling so much across the table to each other. And he would say things like, what's wrong with these Vietnam War protesters? And then I'd say, well, Dad, don't they have a point? And then he'd say, I can't believe you're saying that, you're my daughter. And this is an old military man. So we would have these knockdown dragouts, and sometimes at the end of these conversations, his face would be red and he'd be really angry, and he'd say, well, Ann, I don't always agree with you, but I'd still vote for you for president, which was a great lesson to me, that we can disagree and yet respect each other, and also that we have a responsibility to care what's happening. And so I told Dad that I was going to do something of some service. I wanted to go to journalism school, and I wanted to become a reporter. And then he joked with me, well, actually, I meant for you to actually join the military service. That was his joke, but he was proud of me, actually. He was proud of my choice.
Would you agree on news journalists that we would watch together on the television?
I'm sorry?
News journalists, did you watch the same programs together on
Right,
news?
every night we would watch the evening news. I mean, my father was a big newspaper reader, so we would talk about the news that he would read in the paper. And then later on, it was the evening paper, and then later on we'd sit down and watch Walter. And we watched Walter every night. And my father, if someone sat in for Walter and there was one change in tone or a word or a piece of video, film at that time, that at all felt pejorative, he would get really furious and, and you start yelling at the TV and say, "Stop trying to tell me what to think." And this made an impression. He would say, "See, Ann, they don't have any respect for us. They think we're too stupid, that we're like lemmings, we'll just do what they say." And this had a huge impression. But, there were moments when Walter, Mr. Cronkite, he might not disagree too much with the words, lost it. There were moments when emotion came to him because, the shooting of John F. Kennedy, the Vietnam War, when he felt a need to step into, accidentally or on purpose, into a role of commentary. I think that separating the two as much as you can is the right path. And so I always admired Mr. Cronkite. But I thought I was going to newspapers. I didn't think I was going into television, but I really admired Mr. Cronkite. Because I thought of him as a human being, a real human being who cared about the country and wanted us to know what was happening. And that's exactly the thinking I think that journalists should have. We should have a responsibility to the people we are serving.
So talk about how your career path started forming. Where did you go to college and what were your plans at that time?
Right, so no one in my family had ever graduated from college, and my father was actually in college at the same time that I was graduating from school. And I did not intend to go to college because I didn't have the money for it. And there was no real history of anyone graduating from college in my family.
And he went on the GI Bill.
He did. My father had started college on the GI Bill. But I had an English teacher who, when I told her I wasn't going to college when she asked, marched me down to the office and made me apply. It was too late to apply. The deadlines had all passed except for the University of Oregon for in-state tuition inside the state. So I applied there. I applied to one college, and thank goodness they let me in. And thank goodness they had a school of journalism, which they still do today.
And you were living, we skipped over where you went to high school, but you were living in Oregon at the time.
Right. My father retired in Ashland, Oregon. He began school at Southern Oregon State College. He wanted to become a school teacher, and he was on the GI Bill. And I was finishing high school at that time, and not sure what I was going to do until I finally had the opportunity to think about going to college. And when I applied, I also applied at the same time for some small scholarships, without which I would never have been able to proceed. I worked my way through college. At that time, that was even possible. But I also could not have done it had it not been for some small scholarships that I received.
Mm-hmm. And what shifted while you were there between print reporting and television? How did you think to veer into that?
Well, I studied in the School of Journalism. My focus was understanding the ways one should interview, how one weighs what to report and what not to report, the words one uses, how to cut out pejorative words that might even inadvertently be oppressive in the reporting. And I had a professor who kept trying to get me into television. He kept saying, "There's something about you, I think you should think about television." It was really emerging. It had just started maybe 10 years before, really emerged as a go-to source of journalism. And I kept saying to him, "But, Professor Nelson, television is so temporal. I mean, it comes, it goes, there's nothing to hold on to. How powerful could it really be, and influential could it really be? And I'd love to see a byline. That's what I want." And I wrote in the school, and I continued on. And then when I graduated, I was working off my loans. I had to take loans in addition to get through college. And someone came to me when I was working as a waitress to pay off my loans and said, you know, there's an internship at the local TV station in Medford, Oregon. And she said, you know, you should apply because they'll pay you for pretty much the same amount of money that you're earning here, and then you can go work in whatever newspaper you want to or can get into. So I got a job at KTVL in Medford, Oregon as an intern. And I did everything but clean the windows. I mean, I did errands, I picked up the mail, I ran the studio cameras on television. I was behind the scenes, you know, zooming in, it sort of started my interest in photography, which I'm now a still photographer. But so what I learned at KTVL was that television is incredibly powerful and dangerous, especially in journalism. The power to influence people, to get inside their minds with pictures and sound and words is a sobering power. It's one that I felt early on needed to be met with a sense of responsibility. Because misreporting something on television is very hard to fix. You know, it's not as if you fix something in newspapers, you know, you have your little correction section, and even then, people may not have their facts corrected. But in television, when you can actually cause people to feel something from seeing something and hearing something in just the right storytelling way with the right words, I think there's an even greater responsibility to get it right. And I felt that it was also vulnerable to getting it wrong. You know, not only are human beings and fallible, and there always will be those kinds of mistakes, but I thought television itself, by its nature, was dangerous, if not in the hands of the right people, who at least were skilled, practiced, but also who wanted and cared a lot about the job of informing people, of taking care of the audience. So that seemed a pretty amazing challenge, and I thought, wow, well, maybe this is an area I do want to work in. At KTVL, they asked me at one point if I wanted to be an interviewer, then they wanted me to be a news anchor, and I was awful, and they wanted me to be a reporter at one point, and sort of that was the stepping path, and I kind of had my heels in the ground all along the way, but I was also tempted because I realized that I wanted to be good enough. I felt this tremendous humility about whether I could be good enough. Not to be on TV, but to be worthy of that responsibility, you see. To be worthy of handling the facts and people's interviews, especially when often they're talking about terrible, often, difficult, often, emotional, often moments in their lives. I mean, that's what news is. We go in and we try to gather details about something that's happening. It tends not to be a monotone kind of event. It tends to be something. So to be responsible and to be worthy of that, of capturing that story and caring for it and telling it in a way that's illuminating and not exploitive, that's how I approached it. And I wanted to be good enough. And so I decided to agree to become a reporter at the station at KTVL. The problem was they'd never had a woman ever as a reporter at the station. And so, and they had wonderful, talented men who'd been there for a long time. And one who'd been there for, I think, decades came to me and said, you know, Ann, women have no news judgment, and you cannot carry the camera. No woman could really carry this equipment. So I really think it would be a better idea if you did not take this job. I still remember that conversation. Pretty much in those exact words is how he said it. And I remember thinking at that time, you know, you couldn't argue with someone who said that to you, because it was pretty much accepted. There were very few women. There had never been a woman at the station. So what I said to him was, you know, please give me a chance. And what I thought was, oh yeah, watch me. It actually was the best thing I could have heard because it steeled me. And I throughout my life, throughout my career, I've often heard, I could actually hear the sound of women coming up behind me. I could actually hear them at times. I could hear them coming up the hill, cheering me, because I realized early on I was creating a space that would allow them a chance to be considered. And I felt that women should be reporters, just as men should be reporters, because the stories are about people who are men and women. And there are nuances, and I've found this throughout my career. There are nuances that can be gathered by each differently because of what you bring, because of your gender. And so I could hear those voices, and it made me feel less alone. It was tough to work in an environment where I wasn't wanted. I went into the newsroom. He didn't have a choice but to hire me because the general manager wanted me to be there. And boy, it was everything you can imagine. It was a room full of really wonderful, talented, older men who smoked cigars, not all of them, but most of them. The room was thick with smoke. And they were all against me. They were, because they were afraid, really, that I would change the culture, that I would change the way they spoke to each other, that I was going to modify them in some manner. You know, as men often feel that women do, and frankly, to be honest with you, we do tend to modify men, so I can understand the concern. That's when I learned to cuss. I had grown up in a military family. My father had told me, you know, if you can't think of a better word than a four-letter word, then shame on you. So I'd never cussed until, I got through college, never cussed. I learned to cuss in a newsroom, in a television newsroom, because I needed to have them understand that I was going to accept them and hear them and speak to them in their language. And I used every single word that they used. And their backs straightened up, and when they assigned me 4 times as many stories, 3 to 4 times as many stories as the men would be assigned, I did them as best I could. Had some meltdowns, clearly. People didn't necessarily show me how to use the camera at the beginning, and I had to figure that out, which did not go well. But eventually, I won their respect. And I finally was able to go to the news director and say, I will do as much as the men, but I will not do more. And he agreed. And from then on, I felt enormously supported by the men. And I give them credit for opening their minds to me. And throughout my time, whatever would happen, they were by my side and supporting and cheering me. And that was a great achievement, better than anything else, really, as I had shown them what was possible.
So after you won them over and proved your mettle there, were there any mentors that you had? Did anyone show you not just the ropes of the mechanics of the camera, but how to shape a good news story, how to tell a story and be able to convey it to the public?
Well, I had learned a lot about journalism in journalism school, at School of Journalism at the University of Oregon, which at that time was one of the top 10 accredited schools of journalism in the country. And so I knew what a story was, I knew how to write, I knew about responsibility, so that was clear. But everyone on the news team helped. People showed me how to edit film, they showed me how to run the camera. I used what was called a general camera and a Canon Scopic. One time, there's a great story, I was covering a protest, and people had gone into a federal parking lot and they were protesting at the Bureau of Land Management, and they were burning their trespassing notices that the police had been handing out. And I jumped out of the car, and I was by myself. I was the first one there. I liked having an exclusive, and I was shooting with my Canon Scopic, and then I had to race back because it was just before deadline, and it was late in the day, and the film chain was going to start running, and if I didn't get the film in, it wasn't going to get on television. And I go back to my car, and not only had I left the keys in the car, but the car was still running. And I had to it was locked. And I had to stop a police officer and say, do you have a coat hanger? And someone actually found something and got me in the car, and I got back in time. But yeah, that's the intensity of that. But you know, the team was, I mean, we had the exclusive footage of that story in Medford, Oregon. So that's how you do it. You work hard. You don't let anyone else define what you are to do. You know, you try your best to do your job. But no, I of course I watched people and how they worked. But once I won them over, they could not have been more supportive in terms of making sure I understood things. The other thing I would say is that I met a man named Spud. I don't even know his full name. He was a newspaper reporter, and because you're in a small town working, when you're competing with other journalists, you're with other television journalists, but you know, you're also with newspaper reporters and radio reporters. And one reporter named Spud saw that I was new, and for some reason I think he took a liking to me, and he said, "Hey, Curry, just remember one thing. Don't trust anyone." I thought, well, that's not very hopeful. And he said, "No, I mean, everyone will want to tell you the truth as they want to see it. Your mother will want you to tell the story as she wants it told. Your job as a journalist is to be skeptical and make sure, because your name is on it, and the viewers, people watching your stuff, are going to see it, and you have responsibility. You have to make sure it's true. Even if your mother said, this is the truth, it's your job to check it. Check it, check it, check it." So that was the best advice. And that's been the one, there have been several pieces of advice that have lasted me my career, but that one was one of the earliest. And it's true. It is true. Everyone wants the truth to be told in a certain way. And that's human. That's not bad, that's human. But your job is to tell the truth, not what you think, what somebody else thinks, but what actually happened. What is the truth? And it's something you strive for. I feel almost as if journalists are, I mean, good journalists, in the way I believe of journalism should be. I think journalism is a service job, as I've said. And it's just as a firefighter or an EMT or an ambulance driver responds to an emergency to help people, so is the job of a journalist, to respond, to help people with information. And there have been times when that has been never more apparent. I'm rushing into a chemical spill, knowing it's dangerous, because I know people are living right next to it and need to know whether they should evacuate. You know, I've rushed into so many different kinds of stories like that, it's very clear in my mind that the line between an EMT worker and a journalist, there is a line. You know, I'm not rescuing somebody's life physically, but I could help them, I could help someone know something that might protect their child's life, save their own life. And that's a heavy responsibility. More often than not, you're not doing that. But if you have that attitude, you're more likely to make the right choices in terms of who you interview, what facts you include, how you write your story, and what you fight to cover. And that's been a guide for me.
Yeah, and we'll of course talk about some of those stories. That the one that comes to mind is Haiti, when you tweeted from Haiti, because you had a decision to make about what impact you could make right then. So,
do you want me to tell you that now? Or?
You can, sure.
So, this attitude, this thinking about what the responsibility of journalism really is, has guided all my decisions in my career. So it's why I pushed to cover humanitarian disasters. It's why I've pushed to cover wars, interviewing also women caught in wars, why I went to Pakistan to cover the end of the effort to end polio, to Liberia to cover the end of that war, Rwanda, Congo. I mean, I could go on and on. Why did I push to do all of that? Because there is some good, I believe, that comes from people knowing the truth. So we were one of the first airplanes to land. Our news private plane, NBC plane, was one of the first planes allowed to land in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. And what happened is, the air traffic control tower had been damaged. And so there was no one guiding the planes coming in except a U.S. military plane that was parked on the tarmac that was being used as an air traffic controller bringing planes in. So it was the U.S. government that was deciding who came in and didn't come in. And when we landed, I realized major organizations like Doctors Without Borders were not on the ground, major humanitarian organizations were not on the ground. So I'm thinking, why is a news team on the ground? So I started checking on that because I was getting tweets from Doctors Without Borders about how they were struggling to get in. So I tweeted out a tweet basically asking the U.S. military to let Doctors Without Borders land because they're really good. I had known from much experience in country that they were very good in an emergency at saving lives in real time, not wait, just boom, they're in. They can build fast, get in fast, get the doctors to people fast. So quickly. So I tweeted that out, and then I got a call from a spokesman for the Joint Chiefs of Staff because I, of course, knew them because I had traveled with this gentleman in, I believe it was Afghanistan, and so he called me up and said, what's going on? I said, I don't know why I'm allowed to land, and I'll tell you why, because people are dying now at this moment, and you need to do something about it, and you cannot wait. And he did. He sent out, he got the information of the right people. The tweet, and what happened is the tweet was retweeted and went viral because everyone wanted to do something to help. This is actually a story of how social media can and has done tremendous good. And because people have that in themselves, they can't do it. What can I do? Oh, let me just tweet that, retweet that, and that's how it went viral. Anyway, so they did land. They did operate quickly. They have since come back and told me that it was very helpful to them, and I'm happy about that. Yeah. All you can do is what you can do.
Yeah, we'll talk about bringing your father's wish for you to fulfillment. I mean, with the military and in that moment. Let's go back to Oregon. So how were you comfortable on camera? You said you were pulling the brakes all the time when you were asked to try television. I mean, you were reporting, doing everything on camera. Were you comfortable right away?
No, I was not comfortable being on camera at all. First of all, I'm multiracial, and I was coming in on the idea of being asked to be on camera in an America that didn't know what to do with this face at that time was itself a little off-putting. I wasn't sure, I also, though I have an ability to reach out and speak to people, I actually was raised by a very shy Japanese mother, very shy and very insecure in America because she came to America right after the war. So I had this in me. My hair was down to my bum. It was parted in the middle. I did not know how to put on makeup. I really didn't have a great sense of clothing. So I was not camera ready. I was story ready. I was a good writer. I am a good writer, a good storyteller. In terms of figuring out what the facts should be that should be included into a story. But all the other stuff, I had no idea. So there is actually a photograph of me with the all-male news team, and I didn't know what to do, so I permed my hair, and I wore, I still wear, white collared shirts, but I had like a bow here, trying to sort of fit in, and I sort of, anyway, it was local TV, it was small town TV. I think they gave me a pass, but no, I wasn't necessarily comfortable. But I felt there's some things I was willing to change to do the work. Cut my hair, perm it, put on makeup, which I wasn't used to, try to figure out what the clothing stuff was about. But there are some things I would not change. Standards, my character, what I would or would not do, how to treat people in an interview. So I was prepared to make those choices, and I was comfortable with the choices I made.
KGW Portland, how did you come there?
Well, that's a very interesting story. So when I was in Medford, they actually insisted that I try to be an anchor, and they would put me on and have me be an anchor. And you know, the idea of looking into a teleprompter and reading what's on the teleprompter as I'm looking into the screen and not having written that material, not having reported that material, not having double-checked that material. Remember, you can't trust anyone, right? It just it didn't work with me, and they nevertheless insisted that for some reason I think they, and in some ways I think it was a time when I think they wanted to have a woman on camera. They got to a point where they decided they wanted to do that. So anyway, so to answer your question, I was working in Medford, Oregon, and I was doing these reports, and I had popped up as a sometimes anchor on television. And a man named Ansel Payne, who was a very big deal in the Pacific Northwest, a smart man who cared a lot about journalism, called me up and said, "Hi, I just saw you're reporting on TV, and I think you're really good, and I was wondering if you want to move to Portland and maybe work at a station that I'm involved in, at KGW." And somebody told me he was like a big wig in broadcasting and involved in, I think, a station in Seattle, and he was a huge deal. But I said, no. I am committed to my community. I am committed to giving them the reporting that they need to have. And until I fulfill that mission, I'm not going anywhere. You know, I felt really that if you're coming in and you don't know what you're doing and you don't know how to even fix your hair, you better leave a body of work. If you're going to watch this, let me give you something. So I was focusing on checking. I did some reporting on EMT times, how long it took for emergency medical teams to arrive at an emergency, and discovered that in some cases it was way too long and people were dying unnecessarily. And so I did an investigative report about that and a bunch of other things. And one of my colleagues said, "Ansel Payne called you and you said no? Are you crazy? Are you crazy?" And I remember thinking, maybe I am, you know. And then he called back and I said yes. And so I got to, he said, "Well, I want you to work at a place called, you know, KGW. It's in Portland, Oregon. Why don't you just come up for an interview?" And so I went up for an interview, and I decided to move to Portland and be a reporter there. And so I'd spent a good almost 4.5 years in Medford. I really wanted to feel as though they got what they needed from me. Mm-hmm. And I did. I made sure that I contributed. And then I'm in Portland. I'm going to stay there as long as I give something to them. That was my attitude in terms of the journalism. And they also wanted me to be an anchor, and so I did that a little bit, but mostly I was a reporter. I did that most of the time. I think I did some weekend stuff, but mostly I was a reporter. And so I covered, you know, Mount St. Helens eruptions and the Rajneeshis and homelessness. That was a big topic for me, and City Hall and virtually everything there.
Yeah. What were some of the things that you learned from these local markets that you think prepared you later?
Hard work. What you learn in these local markets is how to get it done even when it's impossible, how to make your deadline even when you don't have time to do the story, how to make do when you forget to put film in the film chain. And you just interviewed the city manager, and the city manager just explained how there is $20,000 missing from the city coffers, and he's sweating and he's really upset, and he's told you this whole story, and you realize you forgot to put film in the film into the magazine, and you've got to call him back again and say, "Can we do that again?" And he says yes, and you have to have the ability to get him to say yes, right? So you learn how to get it done. You learn how to not make as many mistakes. You learn essentially how to sand down the rough parts so that you are more skilled, you are smarter, and you're more agile when faced with the challenge of covering news.
Mm. So in 1984, you moved to Los Angeles to work for KCBS?
Right, and that was another case where somebody came. So when I was in Portland, I got a call from a guy named Don Brown. I got a call from a man named Don Brown who was working with NBC Network News. And he essentially said, "I think you're really good, and I think you should not let yourself be ruined because so many people who are coming up in journalism on television are ruined by not thinking about what's really important in the work. You know, being famous, being on camera, making money, because suddenly people were making money. When I started, you made hardly any money, but people were suddenly making money. And sort of he was concerned about that. So he was a voice in my ear, and he became a mentor to me in my ear. I never met him, but he called me periodically to see my stories in the feed and say, you know, this is good. I think you should think about the writing here. I think you know, I really like the way you edited that. And when I was working in Portland, suddenly I had people, I had a team. I had a cameraman. Generally, they were always men. I had, and generally they would also edit your story, but they were part of a team. You were not alone. When I was in Medford, I shot my own stuff, so I had to use a light stand to measure how high I was and put it in my place where I wanted to do the stand-up, and then move the stand after I'd started the camera so that I could do my stand-up. That's how I did it then. But when I went to Portland, obviously that became much more seamless. So I got a call, not from NBC, but from CBS. And they wanted me to do an interview in Philadelphia. So I went to Philadelphia, the interview, and I realized, boy, I could see what Don was saying about being ruined. In the particular station I went to, I felt their judgment was not good. It was all about ratings, and it just felt scummy, to be honest with you. And so I said, no, I'm not moving, and I stayed in Portland. And then CBS called me and asked me about coming to KCBS in Los Angeles, which was the former KNXT. Yeah. And I went down there and I realized what a story. It is essentially the New York story in present time. It's where immigrants are really arriving now. And it is a multicultural city like few others. And unlike New York, which I had never gone to by this time, but people lived in pockets and community. They were separated from each other. This would be a fascinating story. LA would be a fascinating story. The problem was for me that my father and mother were struggling because my brother had just died in the military, and they didn't want me to go. But I told them that they had to be brave because they had raised me to go off into the world. And so I did. I went to Los Angeles and I became a reporter there.
Was there any thought at that time, having now joined the network of Cronkite, that you might have designs on the nightly news or a national stage?
So I always aspired to be a foreign reporter. That was always my goal, was to tell stories. But everywhere I worked, there were news managers who kept pushing me to be an anchor in Medford, in Portland, and Los Angeles. And I don't know why that is. As I always felt it was not quite me, but when I started getting used to being on camera, realizing that it was working and that I could get used to anchoring. And the way I did that was I would not read anything I had not edited. So that's how I made peace with that.
On the teleprompter, you mean?
Yes.
You
I went through the copy before it got to prompter. And if there's any change, they were in trouble unless they talked to me, because I may not say it. That was the way I made peace with being an anchor. So, and it was hard. You had to get there earlier. Yeah. You had to double check everything. You couldn't talk to primary sources, but you can get a sense that I could feel comfortable about this. I don't feel comfortable about that. I feel like we should change these words. And so I generally would have an impact, a huge impact actually, on the copy that I would read. So I became comfortable with being an anchor. So yes, at that point, once I became comfortable with being an anchor and figured out a system of making sure I could be comfortable with the stories that I was going to be fronting, essentially, which is what an anchor does, I did start thinking, wow, wouldn't it be something if you could have a voice that would, a responsible voice in informing people, like Walter, who was, an idol for me in terms of his sense of fairness, his sense of shining a light on stories that truly mattered. I did. I started thinking about maybe I could be like Walter Cronkite. Isn't that something that a woman of my time and my background, when you ask who would be her mentor, who would be the person, not an active mentor, but who would be her idol, it would be a man, a Caucasian man.
White old man.
Because there weren't, I didn't know of any women who looked like me. I think Connie Chung was starting to rise, and there were a few others, but the really established journalist was Walter Cronkite. So here I was, a multiracial woman, young woman, looking up to Walter Cronkite as my idol.
Did you think of it at the time that network news was just dominated by white males, that you had a chance? Did it even occur to you to ask the question?
I just, I think that in my time, and I think this might really resonate with a lot of people, you just try to focus on what it took to work, to make it work. How do I thread the needle? I recognize that there is no one who looks like me on the Today Show. I recognize there's no one who looks like me in any of the anchor seats on network television. In fact, there are very few who look like me. I don't think very many even on network television. And here I was working at an O&O, a local station owned by CBS, but not a network station. And there was a change afoot, and I was a part of that change. Mm. And I wasn't thinking about the walls. I was thinking about, how do I find the opportunity? How do I find the opportunity? Because now I know I am contributing with the right mind, the right thinking. Have the effort, the humility, and the realization that one has to be worthy for the story, to do the story. That is, to me, the right kind of thing. I know I have that. I may not have the face, I may not have the background, so maybe I won't get as far as I would dream. But I wasn't thinking, oh, how terrible the world is. I was thinking, how do I thread the needle? How do I find the path? How do I prove myself? That's really what I was thinking. There's a phrase that somebody said to me, to be too good to be denied. That's all I focused on, being really good, being a good writer, being a good anchor, being a good reporter, being a good interviewer. And I just figured what would happen was going to happen.
So you felt ready when NBC did call?
Right. So I don't know if I felt ready when NBC called. I think.
Who did call? How did you come to NBC?
There was a man, again, I mentioned earlier, who saw me at KCBS. Excuse me, who saw me when I was at KGW in Portland, Oregon. A man named Don Brown, who realized that I was now available to leave KCBS to come to New York, to come to NBC News. And he really reached out and made it happen.
Who did you interview with?
Don Brown. I also interviewed with Tom Brokaw and Michael Gartner, who was the general manager, or not general manager, who was the president, I guess. He was the president of NBC at the time. And I remember walking into the NBC building and seeing the beauty of that space. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it's this beautiful lobby in the NBC building, the old RCA building that's been painted on the ceiling and on all the walls, and these WPA paintings. They're gorgeous, evocative paintings, and you feel as though you're coming into a hallowed space. And it's very humbling and intimidating. And so to sit across from Tom Brokaw and have him ask you questions about your thinking about journalism was really, I thought, well, even if I don't get a job, this has been a great experience to have that. But interestingly enough, Don Brown had the foresight at that time. He realized that network journalism had to change. That at that time, all the smaller stations and the O&Os had started to diversify, allow more women, allow more people who were not Caucasian men who had gone to Ivy League schools. He realized that this had to change for the network to survive, for it to tell stories that resonate with Americans. So he personally began something on his own, in which he sort of tried to find people who would make the grade, who would be good enough to match, not come up and sort of, because he knew that people who could not make the grade would be chewed up and spat out faster than you can say those words. So he actually was nurturing that talent, and I was part of that tribe that he had found and had nurtured all along the way. So when I came into his office for an interview, he said, well, you know, I'm building the next generation. I thought, what is it, Star Trek? You know, the next generation. And I believe you are part of that next generation that is going to remake this network to make us more reflective of America. And I think you are exactly what we need. But I'll tell you what, if you accept this job, it's going to be hard. There'll be people who will try to fire you. They'll try to find ways to get rid of you because they won't see what I see. You'll have to prove yourself to them. Well, I knew what that was about. I had experience with that. And he, I think, realized I was resilient in that manner. And so he hired me. And I was hired as a reporter first in New York, then I was sent to Chicago as the Chicago correspondent. And then I was asked to be an anchor again. I said no. And they said, no, every time you fill in on Sunrise, the numbers go up, we need you to do that. And I said, okay, and about that time I had been married, I had gotten married when I was in Los Angeles, and we wanted to have children, so it sort of felt like maybe I could sort of do that, and I could make that work, and then get back into field reporting. Again, you know, with the anchoring thing. And so I did that. I became an anchor at Sunrise, and then an anchor at the Today Show, and then I realized that all this anchoring was giving me a chance to fight for stories that I knew needed to be reported. And so I realized there was power in being an anchor in terms of influencing the kind of stories you could tell. Mm. And given how difficult it was to get certain stories on television, I felt this was something I should do.
Did you have more power as an anchor to choose the content and select the stories that made it to air?
Select and choose, no, but to fight for them. I gained, because I decided to become an anchor, I gained the power to have a voice, a loud voice, in fighting for stories that I knew mattered, that I knew viewers should know about. And that is how I became, and these are not my words, but these are words that others have said to me. I became the queen of stories that nobody cares about. You know, stories that are outside the box of what other people were doing. I remember the first time I'd been fighting for some time to do the stories about the genocide in Darfur. I believe that journalism, at the very least, should cover genocide. What are we doing if we don't cover genocide? And I'd learned when I was younger and studying journalism that the Holocaust occurred in real time without being reported in real time on the front pages of the New York Times, which seemed to me a great sin in journalism, a great mistake. And it seemed to me that this should never happen on my watch. So even if my news managers weren't interested in Darfur, I insisted that they should be. And so I remember arguing for these kinds of stories. I argued for Darfur, the Central African Republic. I came in too early to the network to really have a voice in arguing for Rwanda, but I did follow-up stories in Rwanda and in Kosovo after Bosnia. And I was successful getting those stories on television.
Do you think you had to push harder as a woman to go into these war-torn areas? Was there a pushback?
Well, the big pushback was during the Afghanistan and Iraq War. There was not a lot of experience sending a woman into an active war zone where you actually really are vulnerable to dying. And that was difficult, more difficult. Far more men covered from America the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq than women at that time. I was put on a ship, the Abraham Lincoln, in the Persian Gulf, and then I eventually made my way into both Afghanistan and into Iraq for both those wars. I had gone into Iraq before the war. I was in Baghdad. I was interviewing Tariq Aziz, and I fought to do those stories. But it was easy to be sent to a story in a foreign country. In other words, it wasn't easy. It didn't matter whether you're a woman or a man in terms of being sent to a foreign story. But an active war zone was a different matter. I think being sent to Darfur was a different matter. I remember a reporter coming into my office and saying, "So, you're really brave to go and cover this war in Darfur." And I said, not so brave. I mean, they're not targeting Western journalists. They're targeting Black African tribespeople, largely Arab ancestry government targeting several Black African tribes. And so I don't think I'm really being targeted. He said, no, I mean you're being brave to risk your career to do the story. And I thought, wow, I don't think like that. I don't think like that. I'm not thinking, what story should I do so that I further my career? That's not what I was thinking. But that was in the network. There was a correspondent at NBC News who thought that way. And I remember thinking that just seems so foreign to me.
And because it wasn't being covered, how was it even on your radar that was so important for you to go?
Well, newspapers did a better job covering, and they tend to do a better job covering foreign news than broadcast news, largely because television is expensive. It's expensive to take a camera, a producer, sometimes, and also it's expensive because the people who do television tended at that time, and I think still today, be paid more than people in newspapers. And as a newspaper reporter, you could go in just with your pad and your pencil. So, and also I think there's more space in newspapers to tell those stories
Right.
rather than in a broadcast. So for many reasons, newspapers tended to then and still today do a better job covering foreign news. So I was reading about these stories. Nick Kristof in the New York Times was writing a lot about Darfur. And I had been fighting to do that story for NBC News for years before finally gaining enough of a voice to have, and to be insistent enough for NBC to finally say yes. They said yes to my taking one cameraman. A few days, and I had to find the cameraman myself. I found the cameraman. He was ready to go, and he was a great cameraman. And so I was getting ready, and I had done all the research. And at the 11th hour, I got a call from an NBC executive who said, "We're a little nervous because it is, even though they're not targeting you, it is a war zone. Maybe we should send security. And do you feel like you need a producer?" And I said, I can do this. Whatever I can get, I'm going. And they, at the last minute, sent me with a producer and a security person, and which I didn't even really want the security person. It was really for their concerns. But it was really by hook and by crook. I mean, think about that. That they were willing to do it because it was inexpensive. I mean, I've done stories. I remember one time, it was a story I really wanted to do, and they were ready to say no, and I said, "Look, I'll get the cheapest ticket. I'll get the cheapest flight. I'll sit in the back of the plane. I'll do whatever you need. I mean, I'll go off times, off schedules. I'll come back and I'll make sure I do the Today Show the next day as soon as I arrive back, and whatever, And you give them a deal they can't refuse. And that eventually ended up being the way I worked. I would go off into these foreign countries and do these stories and come back with very little sleep and then do the Today Show, you know, it was around the clock work, but it was the price I paid so that I could get these stories on the air. Mm. And I remember one morning I came back and I had so little sleep after, you know, working essentially around the clock, because, you know, obviously when you're on the other side of the planet, you know, filing stories, you're working when everybody else on this side of the planet is sleeping. And so you really don't ever sleep. You sleep for a couple of hours at a time. And then you're flying back, and then suddenly you're on television anchoring on the Today Show. And I would just do that constantly and be half awake when I was doing my job. And I remember one morning, I was so tired, I said good morning 3 times. And I said, good morning, good morning, good morning. I was just trying to grab a hold of where I was and what I was doing. I remember people making fun of me for that. But it was a small price to pay. Yeah. Because, you know, giving voice to people who have no voice and telling stories, their stories, is remarkable. People who have no voice often have the best stories to tell because no one has been listening to them. No one hears the nuance in what they have to say. And I became obsessed with telling those stories and giving these people a voice.
Mm. Aside from just the content you were fighting for, was Dan Brown right when you first got to NBC?
Yes.
He was?
Yes. Yes, he was right. I remember when I first got to NBC, they didn't know what to do with me in terms of, they didn't even have an office for me. And, you know, there was another woman who was part of Dan Brown's next generation. She was an African-American woman.
Was that Deborah?
Deborah Roberts, right, Deborah Roberts. And we became fast friends. And we were thrown together because they sort of didn't know what to do with us. So they actually cleared out an equipment closet and made that our office. Boy, that's a sure way to make you feel like you are just trying to carve a space for yourself. I mean, that's exactly what it was. We were trying to carve a space for ourselves, and not just for ourselves, but for others behind us, coming up behind us. Again, I think it really helped to always hear. I could hear them. Go, you know, make it right. You know, because you knew this had to happen, and if you could get it right, if you didn't get it wrong, that you might make a space. This was always present in my mind.
Do you want to take a quick break?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm kind of squirming a little bit, so okay. Yeah, that'd probably be good.